What might surprise you about the amount of research on organic versus conventional farming when it comes to winemaking? Why are there so many strong opinions in wine just accepted without much challenge or push for validation? And why are traditional wine regions being forced to balance heritage with visibility and branding in today's market? In today's episode, you'll hear the stories and tips that answer those questions in our chat with Alan Ramey, author of the new book, Pressing Matters: The Debates, Controversies and Mysteries That Have Shaped the World of Wine. By the end of our conversation, you'll also discover what makes Pressing Matters different from more traditional wine books, what it was like interviewing more than 100 experts, many of whom strongly disagreed with each other, how growing up in a scientifically rigorous winery shaped Alan's skepticism toward certain claims in the wine world, how studying and tasting wine at Oxford and Cambridge universities reshaped his view of wine as a multidisciplinary field, how debate training influenced the way he evaluates claims about wine, why different wine cultures tolerate or reject elements like oxidation so differently, what working harvests in Chile and Burgundy reveal to Alan about the diversity within regions, whether winemaking decisions can override terroir, and how much of terroir is shaped by natural factors versus history, political, and economic decisions. Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 383. So just ahead of the long weekend, we chatted about great wines for Easter and Passover on CTV's Your Morning this week. You know, this is the one holiday where we're encouraged to hunt for hidden treasures in the wine aisle. The best bottles aren't always at eye level with glossy labels. Sometimes you have to crouch down and think like a chocolate-obsessed child and reach for that bottle everyone else just walked right past. It is that time of the year where inching along while crouching in a public space is considered festive rather than a cause for a wellness check. All of the wines I'm discussing today have earned scores in the 90s from critics, including yours truly. These are 4 outstanding bottles that punch well above their weight and their price points. They stay hidden because most shoppers reach for familiar labels from familiar regions. But Easter tables are gloriously complicated for wine. You've got lamb, ham, turkey, brunch dishes like asparagus omelets, and of course, chocolate. Well, there's a wine for that. And here's a tip if you love brunch. Eggs are notoriously tricky to pair with wine. They coat your mouth and carry a sulfur component that can clash with a lot of wine styles. Eggs are basically the divas of the refrigerator. They want all the attention and refuse to cooperate with the lighting. You want something with bright, lively acidity to cut right through them. So keep that in mind. So let's start right here in Ontario with the Inniskillen Niagara Estate Pinot Noir. It's a true field blend. Inniskillen chooses fruit from 6 different sub-appellations across Niagara, including Vinemount Ridge, Beamsville Bench, 20 Mile Bench, 4 Mile Creek, Niagara River, and Lincoln Lakeshore. It's a geographical group hug in a bottle. Each site contributes something distinct. The bench vineyards deliver refined, chalky tannins. The lake-infused sites add a vivid acidic backbone that keeps the wine energetic and focused. In the glass, the Inniskillen Niagara Estate Pinot Noir has dark berries on the nose, lifted by spice, vanilla, and a lovely floral note. The palate is well-structured but generous with berry flavors that carry through to a long, complex finish. Can you imagine how beautifully this wine would pair with Easter ham or turkey? It's just $18.95 at the LCBO. I should note that all of the wines I'm talking about today are in the LCBO, and many are in broader liquor stores across the country and internationally. That's convenient for those who consider running to the liquor store as part of our core workout routine. Oyster Bay, from New Zealand's premier grape-growing region, Marlborough, has earned the nickname the world's coolest Chardonnay. Here's how popular this wine has become. A glass of Oyster Bay is enjoyed somewhere in the world every single second. It's Canada's #1 selling premium Chardonnay and the largest wine export from New Zealand by volume. Marlborough's warm days and cool nights stretch out the growing season, allowing the grapes in the Oyster Bay Chardonnay to build intense, veritable character while holding on to a crisp, balanced, natural acidity. The grapes are basically on a luxury retreat where they find their true selves before being crushed. The result is a wine of genuine fruit purity. 50% of it is barrel fermented in French oak, which adds a delicate texture and a whisper of creaminess without ever overwhelming the freshness. No. With its bright acidity, this would be terrific with Easter brunch, cutting right through those omelets, bagels, and lox, keeping every bite as vivid as the first. All of this for $20.95 at the LCBO. The Sella and Mosca Winery was founded in 1899 by two Vietnamese entrepreneurs who took wild scrubland near the town of Alghero in northwestern Sardinia and transformed it into one of the largest vineyard estates in Europe. They've been shaping Sardinian wine ever since, helping put this island on the international map. And did you know that Sardinia is one of the world's 5 blue zones, places where people regularly live past 100. Locals often credit their lifestyle, which, of course, includes daily glasses of Cannonau, the grape in this wine. I'm going to try this experiment because my commitment to science is unwavering. The Sella and Mosca Cannonau de Sardegna Reserva, with the grape Cannonau, is genetically related to Grenache, but with a personality entirely its own. On Sardinia's rugged coastal soils, it develops sun-ripened fruit, wild herbs, and warm spice. The word Reserva on the labels tells you this wine has had extra long aging before release, which develops layers of leather and deeper spice on top of that ripe cherry and violet fruit. On the palate, it's smooth and medium-bodied, with gentle tannins and bright acidity, and a long, savory finish. You can almost taste this wine with grilled rosemary lamb chops, a classic Sardinian pairing, and really anything on the barbecue as we head into prime grilling season, perhaps barbecue sausage or steak. It's only $19.95 at the LCBO, a true gem hiding in plain sight. Tread Softly is an Australia winery with a conscience. These wines are certified sustainable, bottled in lightweight glass, and naturally lower in alcohol than most Australian wines. But here's what truly sets them apart. For every 6 bottles sold, they plant a tree. So far, they've planted 3.2 million trees, equivalent to taking over 50,000 cars off the road. They've also started planting in Canada with a sea forest restoration program on BC's Sunshine Coast in partnership with Forests Canada. Impressive. The Tread Softly Pinot Grigio is crisp and refreshing with green apple and lime zest, ideal for your spring brunch and Easter tables. It's the kind of fresh, lifted style that feels like opening the windows after a long winter. The Pinot Noir has ripe cherries and subtle spice with a silky, lingering finish that stays with you long after the last sip. It's light enough to serve lightly chilled, which makes it a brilliant summer red as well. So, you're helping the planet while you pour, and they're only $15 at the LCBO. They're a great Easter gift to give to yourself. And may I just conclude with, may your Easter basket always have a great bottle hiding at the bottom. And then, on City TV's Breakfast Television, we chatted about how the kids' Easter candy haul this weekend is actually a great flavor guide for some fun cocktails and terrific wines. But let me just add at the very beginning, no child's candy stash was raided during the research for this segment. Though, in the name of science, I do believe in duplicating experiments this weekend. So today we're going to find that bridge between your inner 5-year-old who wants to eat sugar until your teeth vibrate and your adult self who enjoys things like structure and balance and restraint. These candy cocktails are your taste roadmap for some terrific wines that deliver those flavors in a more refined, less sugar-fueled way. Now, peeps are synonymous with Easter. You either love them or you use them as packing materials. I consider them the styrofoam of the snack world. I've created a Peeps-infused vodka martini, oh yes I did, as the flavor inspiration for our wine, especially the green apple snap and lime zest notes in this Inniskillen Late Autumn Riesling. Inniskillen was founded in 1975 as Canada's first estate winery to receive a license since Prohibition. Winemakers Donald Zeraldo and Carl Kaiser went to the Ontario government and made their case. Can you imagine? They challenged a decades-old regulatory wall and won. That decision changed Canadian wine history permanently. Inniskillen went on to win some of the most prestigious awards in the international wine world, particularly for their ice wines, and the winery remains one of the most globally recognized Canadian wine names in the world today. This late autumn Riesling carries on that same standard of craft. In the glass, the Inniskillen Late Autumn Riesling leads with green apple and lime zest. There is a touch of residual sugar that gives a soft mid-palate, rounded quality, and then a bright, clean citrus snap that pulls it all back into perfect balance. It's naturally sweet, but never cloying. The beauty of this wine is its versatility. You could pour it to welcome your guests this weekend, serve it with Easter ham, and then take it all the way to Peter Rabbit's favorite dessert, carrot cake. And also, it is the opposite of Peeps, because you want your guests to come back next year. It's just $15.95 in the LCBO. Next up, we have this jelly bean gin and tonic, which gives us the berry and floral flavors from the purple, pink, and red beans. Now let's elevate those flavors in a refined glass of French Bloom Le Rosé, organic, 0% alcohol sparkling wine from France. This is for the person who wants to be elegant and clear-headed enough to actually remember where those chocolate eggs are hidden. French Bloom is crafted with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir grapes with no added sugars, preservatives, or sulfites. Founded by Constance Jablonski and Maggie Fréragine Tattanger of the Tattanger Champagne family, and now with Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy invested, this wine was created to redefine celebration without alcohol and without compromising on taste or sophistication. Frankly, this is the best 0% alcohol wine I've ever tasted. In the glass, French Bloom Le Rosé has delicate red fruit, a hint of rose petals and fine bubbles, and a clean, refreshing finish. It drinks like a serious wine because it is one, and it signals the mainstream arrival of mindful drinking. It's $49.95 at Holt Renfrew or UpsideDrinks.ca, where you can order it online. I also have this lovely lavender spritz. It's a simple, elegant cocktail with 100 ml of French Bloom Le Rosé in a flute glass, add 40 ml of lavender syrup, and finish with 5 ml of freshly squeezed lemon. Garnish with lavender if you like, or a jelly bean if you must, and that's it. It tastes like spring in the south of France, no train or plane ticket required. Next up, we have the Starburst Sunshine Cocktail with vodka, grape juice, and tonic water. It's our guide to the fresh lemon and citrus notes in the Villa Maria Private Bin Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough, New Zealand. Villa Maria was founded in 1961 by George Fistonich in Auckland. He started with a small plot of grapes and built what became one of New Zealand's most celebrated and widely exported wine labels. The Private Bin Sauvignon Blanc is the flagship of the range, and it's earned numerous 90-point scores and accolades from various critics around the world. The Marlborough region defines what we expect from a bold and expressive New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. With the Villa Maria Private Bin Sauvignon Blanc, you get juicy passion fruit, lemon, and grapefruit. It's vibrant, alive, and exactly what you want in your glass when the weather finally decides it's spring. It's also ideal for moments of renewal and reconnection as we transition out of winter and move into fresh spring entertaining. That makes it perfect for your Easter celebrations. And may I conclude with here's to the candy that inspired the cocktail that inspired the wine, and the wine that made Easter the highlight of your spring calendar. On Instagram, I'm at Natalie McLean Wine. Come for the bunnies, stay for the bottles. So, what's new in the wine and spirits world this week? Well, on a somber note, Michel Rolland, the Bordeaux-born enologist, widely regarded as the most influential wine consultant of the modern era, died on March 20th this year at the age of 78. I mention him because he is the man who coined the term flying winemaker, winemakers who consult with wineries around the world. Over 5 decades, Rolland consulted for more than 150 estates across 14 countries, from Harlan Estate, Screaming Eagle, and Staglin in Napa Valley to Ornellaia in Tuscany, Casa La Postel in Chile, and Marqués de Cassier in Spain. His signature approach of riper fruit, polished tannins, and meticulous blending helped rescue Bordeaux from a rough run of vintages in the 1970s and directly fueled the rise of Napa Valley's cult Cabernet movement through the 1990s and 2000s. He was considered in some ways the winemaking corollary to Robert Parker, the U.S. wine critic, who also loved fruit-driven wines. Rolland's connection to Argentina was among his most passionate legacies. He and his wife, Dani, first visited in 1988 and were so moved by the country and its people that he threw himself into elevating the quality of Argentine Malbec at a time when international importers were telling producers their wines were unsellable. He went on to co-found Clos de la Sillette in Mendoza's Uco Valley, a landmark project involving 7 estates producing high-altitude Malbec blends. Laura Catena of Bodega Catena Zapata, who knew him personally for decades, said after his death that she was proud that he had chosen Argentina so deliberately. His Instagram account at Rolland Associés posted a tribute noting he was still full of energy, projects, and travel plans in his final weeks, having been in Argentina working on the 2026 vintage at his Val de Flores estate just before his death. So would we all live that full and passionate life. Cheers to Rolland. A research paper published in the Journal of Personality recently suggests that a person's wine preferences may reveal meaningful things about their psychological profile. The study, titled From Personality to Pour, analyzed close to 10,000 reviews from a major online wine retailer using AI to infer personality traits from the reviews and then comparing those traits to the alcohol content of the wines being purchased. People who scored high in agreeableness and openness tended to favor higher alcohol wines like Cabernet Sauvignon, Malbec, Port, and Sherry. The researchers suggested that open personalities seek layered sensory experiences and that richer, full-bodied wines deliver exactly that kind of complexity. Agreeable personalities, meanwhile, may gravitate toward wines seen as prestigious or high quality, partly because these choices earn social approval in group settings. The counterintuitive result was what happened with extroverts. Common sense might suggest that sociable, enthusiastic people would reach for stronger drinks, but the data pointed in the opposite direction. Extroverts and people who scored high in neuroticism, both preferred lower alcohol options, like Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, and Prosecco. The researchers suggest extroverts may consciously pace themselves to stay socially engaged longer, and that neurotic personalities may be managing a heightened awareness of alcohol's physiological effects. The one personality trait that showed no meaningful link to alcohol content was conscientiousness, which the team attributed to competing impulses, health awareness pulling toward lighter options, and goal orientation pulling toward wines perceived as sophisticated. The practical takeaway for retailers and wine recommendation platforms is that a short personality questionnaire might outperform a traditional taste profile survey when matching consumers to bottles. A bar in Vancouver created a rotating mystery cocktail recently where the only clue is a single emoji on the menu. That's where we've arrived. And it has quickly become one of the most ordered items simply because no one can resist the surprise. In Italy, a small winery released labels featuring handwritten notes from the winemaker about what they were thinking during the harvest. That'd be the winemaker, not the person drinking. That would be weird. Adding a layer of personality that feels almost like reading a diary. In a move that sounds like a sci-fi heist movie, Chateau Angelus in Saint-Emilion, Bordeaux, has developed a world-first anti-counterfeiting system using the DNA of its own vines. They are embedding genetic material from their Cabernet Franc into the wax seals of their bottles. If a fraudster tries to melt the wax to refill the bottle, the heat destroys the DNA, instantly proving the wine is a fake. Yes, I've just got my handy DNA tester as I uncork this bottle. Anyway, a recent record-breaking auction saw a single bottle of 1945 Domaine Romani-Conti, that's the famous Burgundian Pinot Noir, sell for more than $550,000. The twist? The buyer immediately announced he'd be drinking it at his 50th birthday the following week rather than hiding it in the cellar, sparking a debate over whether wine is art to be viewed or liquid to be used. I am in that second camp. And for your calendar this week, April 1st is National Sourdough Bread Day and, of course, April Fool's Day. The sourdough angle is a natural for wine pairing, particularly a funky natural wine or sour beer. For the fool's angle, swap your guests' glasses mid-tasting without telling them to see who notices. No, don't do that. That's just a germ-fest waiting to happen. April 2nd is National Burrito Day, falling on the first Thursday of April. Also, National Peanut Butter and Jelly Day. A burrito calls for a cold Mexican lager, a punchy Malbec, or a Canadian-made agave spirit if you can find one. Good luck. The PB&J angle begs for a peanut butter whiskey cocktail with a raspberry jam rim. April 3rd is National Chocolate Mousse Day, which essentially is an invitation to open a late harvest Vidal or a tawny port and call it dinner. April 4th brings National Cordon Bleu Day, National Carrot Day, and National Ramen Noodle Day. Cordon Bleu loves a lightly oaked Chardonnay or a dry Alsatian Pinot Gris. Ramen calls for a cold Sapporo or a sake, and Carrot Day is your excuse to make a carrot ginger cocktail or a carrot juice spritz. April 5th is Easter Sunday, National Caramel Day, National Baked Ham with Pineapple Day, and National Raisin and Spice Bar Day. These are getting super specific. Easter is one of the biggest sparkling wine consumption days of the year, with mimosas and bellinis dominating brunch tables globally. It's also the perfect moment to pop open a traditional method sparkling wine. Baked ham with pineapple loves an off-dry Riesling, like the one I mentioned from Inniskillen, or a chilled Gamay. Caramel Day pairs beautifully with a salted caramel old-fashioned or a tawny port. April 6th is New Beer's Eve, International Carbonara Day, National Caramel Popcorn Day, and National Fresh Tomato Day. New Beer's Eve marks the night before beer became legal again in the U.S. in 1933, when Roosevelt signed the Cullen-Harrison Act. Crack open a craft beer you've never tried. Carbonara Day is one of Italy's most spirited food holidays and pairs perfectly with a Frascati or a light Pinot Grigio. Fresh tomatoes and caramel popcorn both scream for aperitivo hour, so pour a Campari spritz and call it research. April 7th, of course, is National Beer Day and National Coffee Cake Day. Beer Day marks the actual date in 1933 when legal beer flowed again in America after a decade of prohibition, with people reportedly lining up outside breweries at midnight. Sounds like a Harry Potter release. Celebrate by visiting a craft brewery and doing a tasting flight of styles you would normally skip, or pairing a session ale with something you would usually pair with wine, just to prove the point. Coffee Cake Day pairs beautifully with Irish coffee, a coffee stout, or an espresso martini for brunch. Now here's your weird but wonderful science fact of the week. The difference between American and French oak barrels is not just cultural, it's also chemical. American white oak contains 6 to 8 times more of the compound called cis-oak lactone compared to French oak, and cis-oak lactone is exactly the molecule responsible for that coconut and vanilla hit you get from American oaked Chardonnays and bourbons. French oak has far lower levels of the compound, which is why wines aged in French oak read as more subtle and spicy rather than sweet. When a winemaker chooses their barrels, they're essentially dialing in a flavor compound by the species of tree. The wood is not just a vessel, it's an ingredient. All right, back to today's episode. Two of you are going to win a copy of Alan Ramey's new book, Pressing Matters: The Debates, Controversies and Mysteries That Have Shaped the World of Wine. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and let me know that you'd like to win. I'll choose 2 people randomly from those who contact me. If you're reading the paperback or ebook or listening to the audiobook of my memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much, a national bestseller and one of Amazon's best books of the year, I'd love to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'll put a link in the show notes to all retailers worldwide at nataliemclean.com/383. Okay, on with the show. Alan Ramey is co-president and co-owner of Ramey Wine Cellars. He has been trained in all aspects of the winery, and he competed on the blind tasting team for the University of Cambridge. And he joins us now from his home in Sonoma County. Alan, we're so glad you could join us here. Welcome.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Now, this book is fascinating. Tell us in a nutshell what it's about and what, say, makes it different from other books about the wine industry, or you cover a lot of ground, so can you encapsulate it if possible?
I love reading about wine and read a lot of other wine books, but I was always missing the book on the more controversial, difficult topics. You know, you read a textbook on wine in school and it's all very technical, or then you go to sommeliers and it's a little more about the restaurant scene or blind tasting, or then you have books on wine regions. The commonality amongst those and some others is that they interview wine professionals, people like myself or so many others. But what drew me into wine in the beginning was that wine covers so many topics. It's microbiology, it's botany, it's philosophy, it's psychology, and so much more. And I'd never found a book that encapsulated that sort of totality of it and interviewed so many of the experts in those fields and brought it together around the topics that we don't agree on. Most wine writers want to write what they know about. I wanted to write what we couldn't figure out and then just let the reader decide what they thought on the issues.
I love that. So you interviewed about 100 people for this book. Many of them strongly disagreed about the topics in question, which is excellent. What was it like interviewing people with such differing opinions?
Oh, it was fascinating and confusing. I think it was funny going from one who acted like this was the only way wine could be made, and then talked to another person the next day who just thought that was a terrible idea, for lack of expletive, and couldn't live with it. So yeah, it was confusing because I kept on thinking both people are intelligent. Both people seem very nice and well-meaning, and yet we can't seem to disagree. So I've always been fascinated by that nexus. And again, I tried my best to not put my opinion out and just let the reader decide what they think on that.
Did anyone change your mind about any of these issues?
Oh gosh, I think it's more that I just learned a whole lot more and gained a lot more nuance. You know, growing up, I was trained by my dad, who has very strong beliefs about how wines should be made, and that's my upbringing. And so for me, it was just great to get a lot of different influences and people that might have other takes and learn more of the subtleties of that area.
And was your dad's strong opinions a prompt for making you want to write this book?
My upbringing is in Ramey, the winery, and the way we do things is very scientific. Everything has to have a control trial and experiment before we make any change at the winery. That's always the way it's been. Every year we're doing trials in the cellar to see if there's some micro adjustments, but we would never change anything without a scientific trial. And so I think for me, it was fascinating to learn about not everyone having quite that level of rigor. And yet it was sometimes eliminating to learn that different perspective.
Fascinating. Okay, so your research, the book, required fairly advanced literature reviews, scientific literature reviews. What was it like reading so many scientific papers? And did you have a method in terms of reviewing them all?
It was difficult. And I'd say that was one of the things that also inspired me to write the book, is that it seems like the barrier to entry for opinion in wine is quite low. It's quite easy to have an opinion, and assuming you're a sommelier at a certain restaurant or at a winery, a winemaker at a certain winery, there's often not a lot of pushback because there's a sense of knowledge with those positions. But being born on the inside, I often found that, you do see people saying things without that validation. And so I was interested in exploring more of getting into those other aspects. And I think that's where it landed.
Okay. What was the most surprising thing that you discovered while you were writing the book? You covered so much ground. What stands out for you?
Honestly, the organic chapter, that was probably the most difficult. And again, getting back to the research, I mean, it was difficult because there's so many papers written on it with so many different subfields of science. And so that was a challenge. Sometimes what I was most surprised by was the fact that there wasn't as much published research as I thought. I mean, some people in organics or who are against organics, vice versa, have very strong beliefs. One example would be, there was one gentleman I spoke to who said, we would never use synthetic fertilizer because of the CO2 emissions that brings as a byproduct of the fossil fuel industry. And so therefore, that's obviously the most environmentally damaging. I talked to another gentleman who hates organics, and he said, if you use these really ineffective organic treatments, you have to do so many more spray passes, you have to hire way more people, you have to use more machinery, way more tractor passes, and it's obvious that that creates more emissions, even because you have to use so much more material and ship it in. And then I would do the literature review and look it up and realize, oh, well, there's only like a couple studies. And then I would call up the researcher. In this case, it was the University of Geisenheim, who'd done a really interesting field trial on this and said one more tractor pass. And there wasn't much else research on it. And that was just one field study in one place for a variety, specific variety. So it's always hard to take that study and then infer, oh, therefore we know this to be certain in other climates. And so it seems like there was just a lot of belief without necessarily the surety that backs it up.
Huh. Okay. So you grew up inside of one of California's most celebrated wineries, Ramey Wine Cellars, and yet you initially didn't want to be in wine at all. You wanted to be a diplomat, if I understand correctly. Tell me the trajectory of where you went, because you attended Oxford and then Cambridge, two of the most celebrated universities in England, and then back to the crush pad in Halesburg. Put that together for me. How'd that happen?
It was a couple things. One was I sort of had an idea in my head of what diplomacy was like. And I'll just say the more time I spent in Washington, D.C. looking at that, the more I realized you don't necessarily accomplish all those glorified things. And I still remember I was an intern, and there was one of the gentlemen who headed up the Russia desk right after the Cold War. And he just said, we were doing all this planning and everything, and then we got a call that Bill changed his mind and we completely shifted. Bill Clinton, of course. A lot of the diplomacy spots, the ambassadors, are really political appointees. I mean, it's half of them are about donors that for the political party, both Democrats and Republicans. The more time I spent in DC, the more I felt a little worried about the actual efficacy and change you'd make in the world. But at the same time, I just fell for wine as the other part of it. I was at Oxford, as you said, and I did a little bit of their blind tasting sessions. I didn't stay for the team, but just checked in. And then we'd have dinners and I could legally drink for the first time. I was, I felt like I got away with something. I was under 21 and drinking, which for an American is pretty good. I just started, again, all these different fields of biology, chemistry, history, culture, foreign languages just started capturing my attention. And I thought, this seems like a really interesting way to live life. And so I sort of fell for it and never looked back.
Wow. Yeah, it looks like you made the right decision. Diplomacy, politics versus wine. Yes, moving right along, though. This is a wine podcast. You write in the book that your father instilled one iron rule. Any idea about proving wine? Okay, we talked about the experiments. Then you described being stunned when you entered the broader wine world and discovered not many people work that way. Can you give me a specific example of like a really audacious, evidence-free winemaking claim that kind of stopped you cold? You've mentioned organics. Is there something else along that line?
The nitpicky day-to-day stuff. I mean, like corks, for example. I mean, the number of wineries where they'll change their cork supplier just because the sales rep is a charming individual, and they don't do all the research to know what the oxygen transfer rate is, what the coloration effects are. And so it's just something like that. Or sulfur dioxide, one of the factors brought up in the natural wine chapter, where a lot of people will be vociferously for or against it and have long claims about ageability, but they don't necessarily have the trials in their cellars saying, look, here's the rates of SO2 that went in the bottle. Let's measure it every single year for 20 years, see what that aging trajectory is, taste it to confirm what that evolution is. Is it aging? Is it not? And then adjust winemaking because of that. So I think there's things like that where I it seems like there wasn't a lot of research in those areas. So that's, I think, the benefit and my privilege of coming from a winery that has a little more of that cultural rigor, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you were a competitive debater in high school and at university. You won Best New Debater at Oxford. Wow. How has that background in structured argument shaped the way you read the wine trade's biggest claims or even your approach to winemaking?
Oh, I think you just, you go into things with a lot more skepticism. I mean, you hear claims, and I think because you've spent a lot of time with some smart people who have to tell you you're wrong and you have to fight back. I think you're a little more grounded in thinking through the logic of everything and saying, wait a second, that was a claim, but it didn't have a warrant. And then what's the impact? If you do it for years and years and years, you just sort of start to think in a little more of a technical way about the things you hear. And you're just more used to pushing back than I think without that. I'm not saying others don't or can't do that. That's not what but you just get a little better at it, I'd say, a little more comfortable with it. And so I think when I took that and then I entered the wine world, it seems like, gosh, it's so politicized in many ways. So there really kind of were a little more parallels to, I'd say, kind of policy debates than I expected, honestly.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, you competed on the Cambridge blind wine tasting team. What did that experience teach you that maybe you couldn't have learned any other way?
I took it with two ones. I purposely didn't tell them I came from a wine background because I wanted to sort of get on the team on my own merits. So I think a lot of people in wine tend to lead with, here's what I know and I'm going to tell you. And I very much sort of tried to limit that until I think there was one final time where we were in a social setting and I just couldn't, I didn't want to lie. So I finally revealed. So yeah, for me, it was part of a great blind tasting education. It was a great team, but also kind of a cultural view into British tasting and how that is different than American tasting. I lived and spent some time in Chile and France prior, so it was a nice insight into another culture. And I think anytime I've gone to another country, there's just a different focus on what to drink. And the Brits, I think, don't drink as much California or Oregon wine versus here in California, it's obviously front and center. And so it's kind of nice to be put in a position where you're reminded that you're not the center of the world. I think that's a healthy thing that we should all go through in life. And so I think it's a different focus but a good cultural learning. It's hard to conclude because there's a lot of other things, but I think those are probably some of the big two.
Sure, sure. And do the Brits have a different approach to tasting wine, no matter what it is, than, say, Americans or other cultures?
I think I get into this a little bit in the values chapter, the value of or taste of good taste. I grew up in a culture where if there's any tiny hint of oxidation, that is a fault, and that wine should be poured down the drain. And the Brits, God, they love aging wine. And so I still remember I was at a dinner and there was all these old dons all around me and who'd been drinking their whole life in the fine dining hall, et cetera. It was kind of like one of those like Harry Potter style rooms, dining halls. And I'd gotten invited by an elderly professor who's very kind to me, and the wine went around and it was clearly oxidized, but they were all loving it and having a great time. And I called for a new bottle and they drank it. And I just remember sort of the look of puzzlement on their faces and realizing how different it was. And I just realized that's a culture where if it's a little more oxidized, a lot more people are okay with it. Not everyone, of course. I don't want to generalize. I think there's some that are quite different. But yeah, I think that's something where when I interviewed Stephen Brooke for the book as well, he mentioned the same thing about Australia. When he was judging in Australia, he would find the Australians were very technical about any possible fault, whereas he was a little more, I'd say, open with a little more Brett or a little more oxidation. And so I think that, yeah, putting yourself in different cultures shows you that some things that we oftentimes think are ideas of absolute qualitative difference might not be the same in another place or for another group of people.
Sure. Well, the iconic or maybe cliche bottle is the bottle of sherry behind the books in your Don's your tutorial, whatever.
Touche. Exactly. You got it. That's
it's
right.
Very oxidative. Okay. So you did harvest Vermonte in Casablanca, Chile, and Domaine Mio Camuse. Camuse in Burgundy. Those are very different worlds. What surprised you about those two places, in terms of how they think or approach questions of soil, climate, winemaking? I know it's more complex, but if you can summarize or give us some insights.
No, it's tricky because I think Chile is so, I think, underrated in its wines. I think, as I mentioned, when I went to the UK, it was a very different drinking culture where Californian wines weren't as present. And I think growing up in California, I didn't realize until I went to Chile that most of the import scene is more cheap, affordable things. And I think that's the view of Chile for many. And yet when I was down there, there was all these really interesting microclimates, interesting people, small producers that weren't able to gain entry in the export scene because of how difficult that is. And I just realized what a beautiful, interesting, diverse place with all these cool cultural movements it was. And we just don't seem to appreciate it as much. And so I gained an appreciation for the underdog and what they can do, and that unless you go to a country, you should never truly have a I know everything point of view. You need to taste around a little bit more. So I think that was the main lesson for me there. And in Burgundy, I still remember in my interview for the job, I told Jean Nicolas, my future boss, that I wanted to learn classic Burgundian techniques, and he schooled me right then and there and said, there's no one way to make Burgundy. It was a nice reminder that it's a place that obviously I think so many times people say, "Oh, I love Burgundy, I love Burgundy," and it's like the more you go there and learn the different techniques and the different styles, you realize there is no one Burgundy. In hindsight, I realized my mistake was that is to say I love X place, you're really saying you love this whole different panoply of options. And it's better to be a little more precise and specific and say, well, what style of wine do you actually like? Because sometimes that's in Burgundy and some other places too in the world. That was the main eye-opening thing there, amongst others.
That's true. Like, even regions contain multitudes. No one wants to be summarized into a cliche. It's also true that a lot of what happens in the country doesn't ever get exported, all the differences and all the little gems and everything else that you don't experience unless you go there. So that's an excellent point. So you raised the question of whether human intervention should be part of the definition of terroir, that fancy French term that is defined in many ways by many people, but some sort of combination of climate and soil, geography, etc. Daniel Roberts, a soil scientist whom you interviewed, said there's nothing more destructive to terroir than winemaking. Can you tell me about the specific wine you tasted where winemaking had overwhelmed maybe a sense of place? Or you don't have to name names, we don't have to do wine shaming, but what's your take on his statement, which is pretty provocative, first of all? Nothing's more destructive to terroir than winemaking.
I do think there is just a growing consensus in the industry of just anything that's over oaked and over extracted and overripe tends to kill it. And frankly speaking, I think that's a fairly widespread knowledge at this point, which is why so many regions around the world are pulling away from that. I think I still remember chatting with a wine journalist who said they'd gone down to, I believe it was Argentina, and they thought they'd found this really interesting story that, oh my gosh, everyone I'm talking to down here is making more restrained wines that are a little lighter, and what an interesting expression. And this writer told me that they went back to the story to their editor, and the editor said, yeah, welcome to the world. Every region is doing that. So I do think that the world has learned a little bit of a lesson and is moving in the right way. But that said, I do think there's still some wines that you realize are, I guess, what you'd call Franken wines, where it's like you smell it and you get like, wow, this is really overripe. This is hugely overly late picked grapes. And then you analyze and you realize, wait a second, I'm thinking about the alcohol. And we had a lab downstairs where we analyzed a lot of things, and it's like 12.5 alcohol. So you just know that they de-alked. You can't really use your deductive reasoning skills to bring that home to a place because it's just, that doesn't make sense together. And so I think those are the wines that we've all had and sort of scratched our heads at. And I honestly think, I know my backyard in California is moving away from that trend with a lot of intelligent producers, and so I think that's happening around the world too.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you've tasted wines where they're extremely ripe and big on the nose, but then the alcohol level doesn't line up with that, so they've de-alcoholized the wines. That's interesting. Okay, the anthropologist Marion Demosier calls terroir a strategically deployed myth and says it is an artificial construction with nothing to do with taste or quality used by the elites to empower themselves. That was interesting. How do you respond to that, or what are your thoughts on that as someone who both makes wine and who writes about it?
It's tricky because, again, growing up, I mean, so much of the Ramey culture was blind taste against other wines, and then we have an Excel sheet and we rank them, and we try to, assure we have an understanding of what goes where and what the qualitative differences are. And so I think there's a genuine sort of hope that the world is based on taste, and that terroir is a real thing. I think that's most people who love wines, I think that's the dream. But I think talking to Marion and some others, you realize that there are other forces that shape wine regions, and that delimitation of boundaries and what is defined is oftentimes not based on a objective scientific criteria of what should be. And I think writing the book, I realized that a lot of places that are where the regions were established a long time ago, it was oftentimes people that were quite powerful in those areas that had the political savvy to draw the boundaries where they were. And that's not to say there isn't terroir is therefore not real, but it's to say that we ought to be a little more skeptical about the idea that this is the only climate or soil in the world that can make that kind of wine. I mean, just last week, I had a friend who was in the Danish blind tasting competition, and apparently our wines got put in and everyone was guessing they were Burgundies. And I think it's a nice reminder that I think anywhere there's a cool climate in the world, whether it's California or New Zealand or Australia or others, there are more similarities than we sometimes like to admit. And I'm not saying it's impossible to taste past and try to determine it, but it's often, I think it's a lot closer than many would like to believe. And I think that's explained by the anthropological or sociological scholars that are out there doing great work on this. And I think they deserve to. Marianne's a great writer, and I think more people should be reading her stuff.
And would you say the 1855 classification of Bordeaux is pretty much aligned with that? It was just, if I understand correctly, based on which wines were getting the best prices, right? The highest prices?
That's absolutely right. So yeah, I think there's a very strong critique of that method. I want to allow for the people who would be in favor of it to advocate for that and say that there is something about the history of an estate or a place that might be able to last through the generations. I think there's definitely an argument on that side, but I think most people that would be analyzing that system would have a pretty strong critique to say, well, look, the prices for wines at any given one time in history ought not be a determinant of fate for the next 1,000 years. I mean, in our backyard in California, we see prices going like this all the time, where a cult producer emerges, but then it turns out it was just an investor group and there's no long-term interest, and so it folds. And so I just I think there's now more than ever, there ought to be a little skepticism about price-based determinants of quality.
Yeah, for sure. Cheval Blanc and Château Asson voluntarily walked out of the Saint-Emilion classification of 2022. You described their complaint that under the new rules, quote, we would have had to get an Instagram account, unquote. What does that moment reveal about where wine region rules are heading?
Yeah, I remember that was the gentleman from Cheval Blanc when I was toured over there to learn a little more about it. I would caveat that by saying even before that, there's multiple thoughts. I mean, some people might say that's an excuse to get out of a system that was no longer favoring Cheval Blanc as the top of the stature. And so I think I want to acknowledge that critique before proceeding. But that said, I do think that specific example brings up that question of, we thought these places were all about terroir and codifying and creating a sense of place. And so where are all these other rules being attached to it? I do think in hindsight, you could predict it, because the moment you get a place-based wine and people realize that that is a value creation, that you can charge more money for it, it's more interesting to sommeliers, you get more cultural cachet. Of course, people want to copy that. And so there's so many new either AVAs in the United States or DOCs, Gs in Italy, or other place-based or constrictions in the world. And I think Andrea Mazzalaglio in the UK did some interesting work, Zappalaglio, excuse me, where he said there's all these almost ghost regions in Italy where almost no wine is made, and they just created it because there was a good marketing thing at the time, but it didn't actually have the historical stature to have something that was distinctive. And I think in a world where there's more and more quote unquote special places, I think that begs the question, if everything is special, then nothing's special. And that means that the regions that do have that history, or anyone who wants to be gotten their attention of, needs to fight that much further in the wine marketplace, so to speak, to gain that attention. And so I think that sort of marketing add-on is kind of a logical conclusion of that almost terroir war, if you will, of who will gain the attention of drinkers in the day. And so I can understand the forces that have led them to create it, because if you don't get attention, then those wines don't have higher prices, then your economy doesn't do as well and people are out of a job. And so I can understand that base idea of why you'd want to come up with that. And yet I think there's almost a sense of innocence lost for many drinkers when they hear that story, where they thought it was this innocent little farmer who was just tilling their land, and it's just as simple as that. And I think that's why I wanted to express that story in the book, is to tell readers that there really is a little more of an organizational apparatus that is behind what gets into their glass.
Fascinating. The historical geographer Tim Unwin called the act of drawing wine region borders, quote, the delimitation of privilege. You described the Napa AVA boundary fight in detail, including the phone book argument. What was the phone book argument?
Oh, yeah. There was a huge debate when Napa was being turned into a region, because wines historically that had been bottled as Napa, and this goes back to the 1800s and pre-Prohibition, there weren't rules. So you would have a Napa wine, but it might have grapes from Lake County or Sonoma or Mendocino that would be added in. And so, of course, the first rule was the county barriers, which, to be frank, were a little arbitrary because they weren't drawn for wine-based rules. They were political decisions in the 1800s. But then there's that question of all these, it's Napa Valley, AVA is what they wanted the name to be, but there's several other valleys all around that historically had their fruit going in. And so the question was, what does Napa Valley mean? Is it interpreted literally as this one specific valley, or should it be interpreted more broadly how it often was used? And so lawyers were going back and forth, and they used the phone book because they had changed it from Napa County to Napa Valley to reference a wider region. And that was used as evidence to show that this is common knowledge amongst people of that this name Valley is actually a little broader than it should be. So that ended up winning the day, and it was interpreted. Pope Valley and Childs are now included in Napa Valley, even though you'll notice it's not the Napa Valley's AVA, it's the Napa Valley AVA. And similarly, there were some who argued if it's Napa Valley, that's the valley. There should be two regions. It should be Napa Mountain AVA and Napa Valley AVA. And in that case, again, it was they decided to interpret it in a broader place-based system as opposed to a literal interpretation. So that was hugely important, because those valleys that got excluded from Napa, of course, their economic prospects are dismal. And I think the people who wanted the purity of one place would argue those might not be as good places or are too hot. And I think there might be technical reasons for that, but I think there's also a fairly strong economic incentive. It's obvious to say that the narrower a region might become, the fewer people can use that power, and then that means the money goes to them. And so I think there's naturally incentives to exclude others that don't bring benefit to that region.
Sure, that makes sense. In 2025, you write that Chateau Lafleur dropped out of the Pomerol appellation in Bordeaux because regional sales were too slow to respond to, regional rules were too slow to respond to the drought and heat. What happened, and what were the implications for the appellation systems everywhere if more prestigious estates start making that same calculation?
I think the implication is you almost turn more into in Australia or California, where if the brand matters more than the region. The obvious reason for those strictures had been to create quality standards back in the old days, because if you read your history of 19th century French winemaking, you realize that there was a lot of things blended in and dubious practices and
trucks at night coming in the back door.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Same thing with Napa, as I was just mentioning. It's you use the place name. I mean, Burgundy would have the people who would sell it would say, here's a Vin Romanée, but they would say it was more of the style of Vin Romanée, but they were allowed to use other places. And so there was a desire, for both economic reasons and for taste reasons, there was that push to create standards and make sure quality was going up, so that once a name got established, people couldn't just jump on the bandwagon, use the name to get the attention of the buyers, but then make a terrible wine that would then bring the standards down for everyone else. And so it was sort of that conflicts that created the rules to begin with. So if you raise the bottom standards, everyone should be good. But climate change has really thrown a wrench into that, because if your standards are around a predictable idea of what a region usually is capable of, then it's great. But if you live in a world where you've got these huge striations from hugely hot to very chilly, it's harder to create rules of the road that are standards that you can rely on. And so you end up with decisions like those chateaus are making. We'll see where it goes.
Yeah. So do you think that AVAs and DOCs are going to become a way of the past if, with climate change and with, I don't know, brands just trying to build on their own reputations?
I think there's ways forward. I think not every region is having as strict rules. And I think departures like this are obvious wordings to those associations to not create stringencies that might exclude people. And so I think there is a logical answer, which is just don't do that. And so I don't think it necessarily means the end. I do think it, as climate changes, and this is the other chapter in my book, I get into the question of whether a changing climate means that the identities of these places are irreparably changed, or if there is some stamp that can last over time. And I think there's arguments on both sides, and I let you read the book before I comment on what might be right. But I think there is that tension that's at play right now, and the rules, of course, relate quite closely to that because climate change and wine rules are tied quite closely together, I think.
Mm-hmm. So let's get on to that organic chapter. You note that Fritz Haber, who synthesized ammonia and essentially fed the world with fertilizer, accepted his Nobel Prize in chemistry just 1 year after fleeing from Switzerland over his role in chemical warfare. So the man who gave us modern fertilizer was also the man who gave us poison gas. How does that duality shape the way you think about the organic debate?
The Fritz Haber story had been one used by, I think, several in the organic movement, or at very least, there's oftentimes a description of World War II bombs and the association of those and some of the fertilizer. And I think that that's a very uncomfortable thing for many. So I think I used that. I did a little research to color the story a little bit more so that readers can understand that in a little more depth. But I used it because it was a common refrain amongst those who are worried about chemicals in agriculture as a whole. And so I think it was indicative of what many feel about that worry of being a little too close to something that is so damaging. I think what the other side would respond with is to say, just because chemistry oftentimes has confusing names and just because something might have had an association with the same person who invented this also invented something bad, that doesn't necessarily mean that the agricultural chemical is a bomb that is destroying people. So I think there's a pushback saying that that's a simplification. So I use that to just kind of get at that tension at the beginning of the ideas of naturalists and chemicals.
Sure. And what's your own approach at the winery in terms of organic, how do you go about it?
I think kind of like I said, for the winemaking side, it's case by case and study by study. And so we look at everything and then see what the results are. I think for us, we're in a fortunate position that the winery doesn't need to have extra associations with it for marketing reasons. And so I don't think we need the organic stamp. I think most people who know the winery know that there's a lot of thoughtfulness that goes into our farming, and they know that we're not doing anything that is egregiously harmful to the environment. So I think there's a sort of a trust that we've earned over years of that time. That said, I think that there's biodynamic practices that we've trialed. There's organic practices we've trialed. We have an organic spray program for the spray side, although sometimes depending on what some vines might need, there might be a non-organic fertilizer. So there's the pesticide side and the nutrition side. And I think there was one of the critics of organics from Harvard had said that, at first it was just the fertilizer side for organics. And then it was really the 1970s where you started to see this movement questioning chemical use that come in. And it was sort of like organic completely changed at that time. It evolved, I should say. And so I think that, we just test everything on a case by case basis, measure the results, make sure everything's done responsibly. But we're very aware of what all those different farming mechanisms do. And we try our best to be respectful and do our research.
Yeah, because I've heard of wineries that have gone for organic certification and put it on their label, but then hit a really bad year where they're going to lose the whole crop if they don't use pesticides or whatever, and then suffer the market consequences of either losing the crop or removing the designation, people going, what are you doing? So I imagine it's a hard thing to
Exactly. It's
engage in.
quite tricky. And in fact, I mean, a lot of people, and this is why I wrote another reason I wrote the book is that I think, if you were making wine in the 1970s, the crazy or brave thing to do would be to go organic because that was unusual at the time. And so that was, a very odd, almost countercultural choice. Now the sort of weird, brave thing to do or counterintuitive thing to do is to not be organic, because I think organics over the last 50 years has established such a standard for environmental quality that if you're not organic, I think sometimes there's this question of, well, are you just, since you're not fully invested in the boat, therefore you're environmentally irresponsible. Not everyone thinks that, but I think certainly some do. And that is to the credit of the organic system. Consumers don't really know otherwise. And so it is sort of a sense of proof that you're actually doing what you're doing instead of greenwashing. So I think that's one of the better arguments in favor of organics, that it's just a clarity for consumers. With that said, I think there's a lot of changes happening right now in organics. That's what I tried to get the sense of in the book, that organics is not just one thing. Different countries have different organic standards. What is organic in the US is not organic in the EU. The EU just made huge changes with copper. Last month or so, that are taking a lot of people out of it. And so I think there's that concern as well.
The USDA organic standard permits sulfur as synthetic because it's derived from petroleum refining, while banning arsenic because it's toxic, even though it's entirely natural. And you write that it's with some irony that a petroleum byproduct is one of the most commonly used sprays in a naturally inclined system. How does that contradiction reveal the limits of how we define organic? So you're getting at that right now, but is there anything else you'd add to that?
I mean, I use that point because I think so often there's, at least in the sort of marketing side of wineries, it's very, and whether it's an organic winery or not, I think that's very common to say, oh, we don't spray anything or we don't like chemicals. And yet I think oftentimes they're using chemicals and sort of, I say chemicals when it's something bad, but when we spray it, it's okay. Or sort of just a pretend idea that we don't. Honestly, I think some wineries probably don't even want to talk to their sales staff about that side of the business. I mean, and so I think there's just sort of a lack of education and focus on that. I think it's a tricky one because I think that a little minor contradiction in the idea of purity for organics has been true from the beginning, because it's a great concept that I think that's why so many people feel for it. Again, when the 1990 organic rule passed the U.S. Congress, it was the most written about program in the history for California. So it's clearly people like the idea of purity in their products. I think what the difficult thing is implementing it. And so I think one example would be, for example, in the US, the question was, if it's organic, therefore you should only have organic manure that goes in the grapes. And that was decided back in the 1990s that wasn't possible because there wasn't enough organic manure to be able to get around. And so they said, okay, you can have non-organic manure to go into organic vegetables. And so I think that was one that I think the purists at the time thought was a bad decision, and they would have loved it to be a little more pure throughout the whole chain. But you can see how there's just a slight allowance for flexibility, for realism. And so I think that's another example of it. I think the sulfur one is another one where you could argue it's a contradiction, but I think the ones who are implementing it would say, look, it's not as toxic as other sprays. This allows us to be able to use it in a better way. And I think there's the practical argument that actually mining sulfur in the ground might not actually be a better process than the byproduct from refineries. So again, if you're looking at it in terms of the extraction and the outcomes, I think that even though it's counterintuitive, I think some could defend it fairly well. But again, I brought that up because I think I can see people disagreeing on both sides of that. And I think it's just a fascinating little insight into sort of the hows of organic became what it is today.
It absolutely is. I think you should have called your book It's Complicated. Though that probably wouldn't have been a good marketing angle.
Yeah.
Who's going to buy It's Complicated? Anyway, I do like pressing matters. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Alan. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, what might surprise you about the amount of research on organic versus conventional farming when it comes to winemaking? As Alan notes, the organic chapter was the most difficult one of the book because there are so many papers written about organics in so many different subfields of science. There was one expert he spoke to that said he'd never use a synthetic fertilizer because the CO2 emissions that it brings as a byproduct of the fossil fuel industry would just obviate it, and so therefore it is the most environmentally damaging. Then he talked to another expert who hates organics because he said that when you use ineffective organic treatments, you have to do so many more spray passes of the vineyard, and you have to hire a lot more people, use a lot more machinery, a lot more tractor passes, and that creates more emissions. So it seems like there was just a lot of belief, Alan noted, without necessarily the surety or evidence that backs it up. Number 2, why are there so many strong opinions in wine accepted without much challenge or push for validation? Alan says that it was one of the things that inspired him to write the book. It seems like the barrier for opinion in wine is quite low. I love this understatement. As he says, it's quite easy to have an opinion, and assuming you're a sommelier at a restaurant or a winemaker at a winery, but there's often not a lot of pushback because there's a sense of knowledge with those positions. However, having been born on the inside of the industry, Alan found that he often noticed people saying things without the evidence. So he was interested in digging into that aspect. And number 3, why are traditional wine regions being forced to balance heritage with visibility and branding in today's market? Alan says the moment you get a place-based wine and people realize that that is value creation, you can charge more money for it. And it's more interesting to sommeliers, recommending the bottles in restaurants. You get more cultural cachet. So people want to copy that. That leads to more and new AVAs, American Viticultural Appellations, in the United States, DOCGs, Denomination, Origine, Contrôlée, Garantita, in Italy, and other place-based constrictions and demarcations in the world. Alan notes that Andrea Zappagalli in the UK did interesting research work where he observed that there are ghost regions in Italy where almost no wine is made, and it was created because it was good marketing at the time, but it actually turned out not to have historical stature because the wines really weren't distinctive to that region. Alan believes in a world where there's more and more special places, it begs the question, if everything is special, then nothing is special, right? And that means that regions that do have history and something special to offer, they really need to fight in the marketplace to gain that attention that they deserve. If you missed episode 159, go back and take a listen. I chat about cosmopolitan cocktails on Sex and the City, champagne, and whiskey women with Mallory O'Meara. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite. The signature drink of Sex and the City was the Cosmopolitan. How did that happen?
Up until that point, besides Julia Child drinking wine, there weren't many women drinking on TV. Carrie Bradshaw orders a Cosmo. Here was this very feminine drink. It's in a martini glass, but it's pink. A lot of girls couldn't afford Louboutins or a Coach purse, but women could afford to order a Cosmo. So women wanted to be like Carrie. They wanted to feel literally cosmopolitan. And all of a sudden, the drink swept the nation like wildfire. It really became the first cocktail that women were influenced from the media to order, and people still drink it today.
You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Alan. To give you a taste of future guests, we'll have Michael Finnerty on pairing wine and cheese, Dr. Charles Knowles, who's just published a best-selling memoir on why we drink too much, Marisol de la Fuente on the wines of Argentina, and Nicole and Ramon Bassett on Tasting Victory, the life and wines of the world's favorite sommelier, Gerard Bassett. Do you have a question for any of our guests? Please let me know. Do you know someone who'd be interested in learning more about wine myths and misconceptions? Please let them know about the podcast. Email them or text them now while you're thinking about it. It's easy to find the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. Just tell them to search for that title or my name, Natalie McLean Wine, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, their favorite podcast app, or they can listen to the show on my website at nataliemclain.com/podcast. Email me if you have a sip tip question or you'd like to win one of 7 drinks books that I have to give away. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on this episode, or if you've read my book or are listening to it. Email me at natalie@nataliemclain.com. In the show notes, you'll find a link to take a free online wine and food pairing class with me called the 5 Wine and Food Pairing Mistakes That Can Ruin Your Dinner and How to Fix Them Forever at nataliemclain.com/class. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclain.com/383. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a glass of spring fresh organic wine. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemclain.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.